The scent of pine and crushed frost clung to the air in the great meadow, a sharp, clean smell that did little to mask the cloying stench of anxiety. It was the day of the unfurling, the annual ceremony where the unmated wolves of the Blackwood pack were presented. For most, it was a day of hope, a chance to find a mate and solidify their place in the rigid hierarchy. For Seraphina, it was a ritual of humiliation. She stood at the edge of the gathering, a ghost in a threadbare tunic the color of dishwater, her thin shoulders hunched against the biting wind and the colder stares of her packmates. Whispers followed her like burrs on a pelt. The wolfless Omega. A blight on the pack. Why does the Alpha even allow her to stand here? She felt each word as a physical blow, a fresh bruise on a spirit already tender with them. She was not truly wolfless. She could feel her wolf, a timid creature huddled in the deepest corner of her soul, too small and frightened to ever break through the skin. In a world that prized strength, size, and ferocity, her wolf was a flicker in a blizzard, and so she was deemed broken. Her older sister Cassia stood near the center of the clearing, radiant and proud. Her fur, when she shifted, was the color of polished obsidian, her form sleek and powerful. Even in human skin, she radiated an aura of predatory grace. She caught Seraphina's eye and offered a look that was a carefully crafted mixture of pity and impatience. It was the look she always gave her, one that said, "Why can't you just be normal?" Seraphina dropped her gaze to the frozen ground, her fingers tracing the frayed hem of her sleeve. She possessed a skill, a strange little quirk that the pack elders had dismissed as useless. She could soothe. A crying pup would quiet at her touch. A panicked bird with a broken wing would calm under the low, humming melody she unconsciously produced. She could mend small things, torn leaves, bruised petals, minor scrapes, with a focused thought and a soft song. But she couldn't mend herself, and she couldn't conjure a wolf worthy of respect. In the brutal calculus of the northern clans, her gift was worth less than nothing. Alpha Gregor cleared his throat, his voice a gravelly boom that silenced the murmuring crowd. Today, we show our strength. We present the future of the Blackwood pack. He began the roll call, his gaze sweeping over the assembled wolves with a critical eye. Each name was met with a proud step forward, a confident posture. When he finally reached the end of the list, his voice dripped with disdain. And Seraphina. She flinched, forcing her feet to move. She stepped into the central ring, the mud sucking at her worn leather shoes. A wave of snickers rippled through the crowd. She kept her head down, her pale hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She felt like a weed presented in a bouquet of winter roses. Suddenly, a new scent cut through the familiar smells of the forest: ozone, cold iron, and an ancient predatory power that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The whispers died instantly, replaced by a tense, fearful silence. Every head, including Alpha Gregor's, turned towards the tree line. From the shadows emerged a group of riders, their mounts not horses, but enormous dire wolves, whose paws barely seemed to touch the ground. At their head rode a man who was less a man and more a living embodiment of winter's wrath. He was tall and broad-shouldered, clad in black leather and dark fur that seemed to drink the light. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, his eyes the color of a frozen lake, and his black hair was shot through with streaks of silver, though he looked to be no older than 30. This was King Alistair, the Alpha King of all the northern clans, the Shadow King. A ruler so feared it was said he had no heart, only a shard of ice in his chest. And his wolf? No one had ever seen it. Rumor said it was a monster, a creature of pure shadow and rage that he kept caged within his soul. He dismounted with a fluid grace that was utterly terrifying, his presence a physical weight pressing down on the entire meadow. His gaze swept over the pack, dismissive and cold, until it landed on the pathetic figure in the center of the ring, on her. Serafina felt that icy stare like a spear through her chest, and for the first time in a long time, the fear she felt was not for her pride, but for her life. King Alistair's gaze lingered on her for a moment that stretched into an eternity. It was not a look of lust or even interest, but one of profound, chilling assessment, as if he were examining a peculiar insect. The pack held its collective breath. Alpha Gregor, his earlier bravado completely gone, bowed low. Alpha King Alistair, we are honored by your unexpected visit. Alistair did not acknowledge the greeting. His eyes remained locked on Serafina. A tribute is owed, he stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very soil. Your pack has been late in its tithes of grain and steel for 2 seasons. I have come to collect. Panic flickered in Gregor's eyes. Of course, my king. We have the stores ready. We meant no disrespect. I am not here for grain, Alistair said, his words sharp as obsidian shards. I require a different sort of payment, a servant for my citadel, someone to attend to the quieter duties. A collective sigh of relief, quickly stifled, passed through the pack. A servant was a small price to pay. Alpha Gregor straightened, a sycophantic smile stretching his lips. Of course, Your Majesty. We have many fine, strong women. Cassia, step forward. Cassia moved with practiced elegance, her head held high, offering the king a respectful yet confident curtsy. She was the pack's prize, and Gregor was offering her up like a trophy. But Alistair's gaze slid past her as if she were made of glass. It returned to Serafina. At that moment, another wolf stepped from behind the king's retinue. He was older, his face a roadmap of scars, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence. This was Lord Vorlag, the king's uncle, a man whose ambition was as legendary as his cruelty. Vorlag's lips twisted into a sneer as he looked at Serafina. An interesting custom you have here, Gregor. Presenting your runts? Is she your offering? He let out a short, barking laugh. Perhaps my nephew has a taste for charity. The insult was twofold, one against Serafina, and a more subtle, sharper one against Alistair. It implied the king was weak, a collector of broken things. Serafina saw a muscle twitch in Alistair's jaw, a flicker of something dark and violent in his frozen eyes. Alpha Gregor, eager to please and terrified of both men, saw an opportunity. Offering Cassia was a risk. She was valuable. Offering Serafina was no loss at all. In fact, it was a way to rid himself of a pack disgrace and turn it into a perceived act of obedience. She is an Omega, my Lord Vorlag, Gregor said, his tone dismissive. Hardly a worthy tribute for the king, but if he desires a servant. Vorlag's grin widened. Oh, I think it's perfect. A fitting servant for the Shadow King's cold halls. What do you say, nephew? Shall we take the little mouse? The entire world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between her and the king. Serafina's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She was being offered up like a sack of unwanted potatoes, a piece of trash to be disposed of. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the king's cold refusal, for another peal of mocking laughter. She will do, Alistair said. The 2 words were a death sentence. Serafina's eyes flew open. He had accepted. He was taking her. Not Cassia, the beautiful and strong, but her, the wolfless and weak. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She saw Cassia's look of stunned disbelief, quickly masked by relief. She saw her alpha's smug satisfaction. No one protested. No one spoke for her. She was a stone being skipped across a lake, and no one cared where she sank. 2 of the king's guards moved forward. They did not touch her, but their presence was enough to herd her towards the dire wolves. She stumbled, her worn shoes catching on a root. She didn't fall, but her tunic, already thin, ripped further at the shoulder, exposing the pale skin beneath. She heard a final parting snicker from someone in the crowd. She was given no time to say goodbye, not that anyone would have cared to receive one. One of the guards lifted her effortlessly and set her on the back of a dire wolf that was not his own, a beast of charcoal fur and intelligent yellow eyes. She clung to its thick ruff, her body trembling uncontrollably. As the procession turned to leave, Seraphina risked one last look back at the life she was leaving. She saw her sister turning away, already absorbed back into the fold of the pack. She saw her alpha clapping another wolf on the shoulder, their shared laughter carrying on the wind. They were not just letting her go, they were celebrating it. In that moment, the deep, aching shame she had carried her whole life curdled into something else. It was a cold, hard knot of grief, and beneath it, a tiny, defiant spark of anger. They had thrown her away. Fine. She would not let them see her break. She lifted her chin, stared straight ahead into the dark, unwelcoming forest, and did not look back again. The journey to the king's citadel was a blur of silent, swift movement. The dire wolves ran with an unnatural endurance, their paws eating up the miles of frozen tundra and skeletal forests. Seraphina clung to the thick fur of her mount, the wind whipping tears from her eyes until they froze on her cheeks. No one spoke to her. She was cargo, a piece of tribute, and she was treated as such. The citadel rose from the mountainside like a fang of black rock, a fortress carved from the mountain itself rather than built upon it. It was a grim, imposing structure, devoid of warmth or welcome, with narrow windows like suspicious eyes staring out over the desolate landscape. As they passed through the massive iron gates, a profound silence fell, a quiet so deep it seemed to absorb all sound. This was a place of secrets and sorrow. She was dismounted and led by a guard through echoing stone halls, torches guttered in iron sconces, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. There were no servants bustling about, no sounds of life, only the whisper of drafts and the distant howl of the wind. She was taken to a vast vaulted chamber that she assumed was the throne room. King Alistair was there, standing before a hearth where a fire struggled to burn. He had shed his heavy traveling cloak, and in the flickering light, he seemed even more formidable. He turned as she was pushed into the room, his icy eyes pinning her in place. The guard bowed and retreated, leaving her alone with the Shadow King. "You are in my domain now, Omega," he said, his voice devoid of any inflection. "Here, you have one purpose, to obey. You will be assigned to the kitchens. You will work, you will be silent, and you will remain unseen. Do you understand?" Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the spark of defiance that had ignited in the meadow had not been extinguished. She would not grovel. She would not weep. She met his gaze directly, a feat that cost her nearly all her courage. "I understand," she managed, her voice a reedy whisper. For a heartbeat, something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise, not quite. It was a flicker of curiosity, as if a mouse had not only failed to scurry away, but had looked him in the eye. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the instinct to recoil. He was so tall, a towering monolith of power. He smelled of winter storms and cold stone. "What is your name?" he asked, the question sharp and unexpected. "Seraphina." "Seraphina," he repeated, the name sounding strange on his tongue. He circled her slowly, his movements fluid and predatory. She stood her ground, her body rigid with tension. "The Blackwood pack cast you out. They gave you to me as an insult, a piece of refuse to clutter my halls. Tell me, What is so wrong with you that your own alpha would discard you so easily? The question was a deliberate cruelty, designed to strip away her last shred of dignity. The familiar shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. I. My wolf is not strong, she admitted, her gaze finally falling to the stone floor. I am not a warrior. Or a hunter. You are nothing, he finished for her, his tone flat. He stopped in front of her again. And here, nothing is what you will be. He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. But as he faced the fire, his body went rigid. A low sound, a pained grunt escaped his lips. His hand flew to his temple, his knuckles white. She saw it then, just for a second, in the reflection on a polished shield hanging on the wall. A flicker of pure agony contorted his features. Black veins seemed to pulse for a moment at his neck before vanishing. It was a glimpse of a profound weakness, a crack in the icy facade. It was raw, untamed pain. The sight struck a chord deep within her, resonating with her own strange gift. The instinct to soothe, to mend, rose in her unbidden. She felt a low hum begin in her chest. She caught herself instantly, clamping her mouth shut. He must not know. He would see it as another weakness, another deformity to be despised. He straightened, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. When he spoke again, his voice was even colder than before, laced with a new, dangerous edge. A guard will show you to your quarters. Do not leave them after dark. There are parts of this castle that are not safe. For anyone. It was a threat. Plain and simple. She nodded dumbly, her heart still racing from what she had witnessed. A stern-faced woman with a bundle of keys appeared at the doorway, her expression sour. She beckoned to Seraphina. As she was led away, Seraphina chanced one last look at the king. He was staring into the fire, his posture ramrod straight, but she could sense the tension coiling in him, the barely restrained violence of a man at war with himself. Her room was a small, cold cell in the servants' quarters, with a hard cot and a single blanket. It was a prison, but as she sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, it wasn't the cold or the hardness that occupied her thoughts. It was the fleeting image of the king's pain. She had been brought here as a thing, a piece of tribute. But she had seen something she wasn't meant to see. She had seen the monster's wound. Life in the citadel settled into a grim routine. Seraphina worked in the cavernous kitchens, scrubbing pots until her hands were raw and chopping vegetables until her arms ached. The head cook, a gruff, portly man named Alaric, largely ignored her as long as her work was done. She was a ghost, drifting through the stone corridors, her presence barely registered by the few guards and servants who populated the desolate castle. It was a lonely existence, but in its anonymity, there was a strange sort of safety. She held the king's warning close to her heart, never venturing from her small room after the sun had set. Yet, she could not escape him. The castle itself seemed to be an extension of its master, brooding, silent, and filled with a deep, resonant sorrow. And at night, she would sometimes hear it, a sound that chilled her to the bone. It was not a human sound. It was a low, guttural roar of agony that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the fortress, a sound of a great beast tearing at its own cage. The first time she heard it, she had huddled under her thin blanket, trembling, convinced some terrible creature roamed the halls. The other servants seemed deaf to it, or perhaps they had simply learned to ignore the king's private torments. One night the sound was worse than ever before. It was a symphony of pain, a desperate, raging bellow that spoke of a battle being lost. Something inside Seraphina shifted. It was not courage, but a strange, compelling empathy. The same instinct that made her reach for a wounded bird now pulled her from her bed. She had to find the source of that sound. The need to soothe it, to quiet it, was an ache in her own chest. She crept from her room, her bare feet silent on the icy floors. The roars grew louder, guiding her up a winding staircase, away from the servant areas and towards the royal wing, a place she had been forbidden to go. The sounds led her to a long, tapestry-lined corridor. At the far end were the massive oak doors of the king's chambers. The roars were coming from inside. Fear warred with compulsion. He would kill her if he found her here. But the sheer, unadulterated agony in that sound was overwhelming. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart. She pressed herself against the wall opposite his doors, hiding in the deep shadows cast by a pillar. She was too afraid to go closer, too captivated by her strange empathy to flee. She closed her eyes, focusing on the pain that radiated from the room, and she did what came naturally. She began to hum. It was a soft, low melody, a wordless tune she had used to calm frightened fawns in the woods back home. She poured all her focus into it, weaving a thread of peace into the simple notes, and sent it across the space like a prayer. Inside the room, the roaring faltered. It was replaced by a strained, harsh breathing. Seraphina kept humming, her own heart pounding in her ears. She felt a subtle shift in the air, a lessening of the oppressive, violent energy that had been pouring from under the door. After a few minutes, a heavy silence fell. She waited, her body frozen in the shadows, for what felt like an hour. There were no more sounds, no footsteps, no guards. Finally, her fear of being discovered outweighed the strange pull that had brought her there. She scurried back to her room, her mind reeling. This became her secret. Nearly every night the king's agony would echo through the stone, and nearly every night she would creep to her hiding spot in the corridor and hum her quiet song. She never saw him. She never knew if he was aware of what she was doing. But each time, the roaring would cease, and a fragile peace would descend upon the castle. It was a strange, intimate connection, a bond forged in secrets and shadows. Alistair, meanwhile, was experiencing something he hadn't felt in a decade, a moment of reprieve. The curse was a living thing inside him, a feral beast of shadow that clawed at the walls of his soul, demanding release. Most nights, the battle to contain it left him exhausted and bleeding, his rooms often destroyed in his struggle. But recently, something had changed. Just as the pain reached its crescendo, when the shadow wolf threatened to rip its way free, a strange calm would wash over him. It was like a cool balm on a searing burn, a quiet melody that only his soul could hear. It pushed the beast back, not with force, but with a gentle persuasion he couldn't comprehend. It granted him a few precious hours of peaceful, dreamless sleep. He began to anticipate it, to crave it. He searched for its source, but it was ephemeral, like a scent on the wind. It was strongest near his chambers, yet untraceable. He questioned his guards, who reported nothing. He started to wonder if he was going mad, if the curse was finally creating delusions to torment him further. One afternoon, as he was walking through the castle's neglected inner garden, he caught a trace of that same feeling. It was faint, but it was there. A sense of peace, of quiet mending. He followed it to a small, sheltered corner where a bed of winter roses was struggling to survive, and there she was. The Omega from Blackwood, Seraphina. She was kneeling in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration as she gently touched the stem of a rose that had been snapped by the wind. And she was humming. It was the same melody, the melody from his nights. Alistair froze, hidden behind a stone archway. He watched as a faint silvery light, almost invisible in the daylight, seemed to emanate from her fingertips. The bent stem of the rose slowly, impossibly, began to straighten. The bruised petals regained a hint of their color. He felt the beast within him, usually a raging inferno, settle into a low, rumbling purr. It was a feeling of recognition, of contentment. She was the source. This small, discarded girl, this wolfless Omega with her secret songs was the only thing that could soothe the monster inside him. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. She was not a piece of tribute. She was not an insult. She was a miracle. And she was living in his dungeons, scrubbing his floors. He felt a surge of something fierce and possessive, a feeling so foreign and overwhelming it stole his breath. He needed to keep her safe. He needed to keep her close. But if he brought her closer, if he revealed what she was to him, he would be exposing his greatest weakness to the world. And in his world, weakness was a death sentence. The fragile piece of Seraphina's secret routine was shattered by the arrival of Lord Vorlag. He swept into the citadel with his personal guard, his presence a foul miasma of ambition and disdain. He treated the castle as his own, his booming voice and mocking laughter a sacrilege in the quiet halls. Seraphina did her best to remain invisible, keeping her head down as she worked. But Vorlag seemed to have a sixth sense for locating the object of his scorn. He found her in the kitchens, where she was kneading dough. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning against the doorframe, his eyes raking over her with contempt. "The little mouse is still scurrying about. I'm surprised my nephew hasn't grown tired of his charity project and tossed you to the wolves." Alaric, the head cook, stiffened but said nothing. No one dared to challenge Lord Vorlag. Seraphina kept her gaze fixed on the dough, her knuckles white as she worked it. "My lord," she murmured, a token of deference. "My lord," he mimicked in a high-pitched, mocking tone. "She can speak. Tell me, mouse, has the king found a use for you? Or do you simply warm a spot by the hearth and eat his food?" Before she could answer, a cold voice cut through the air. "She serves at my pleasure, uncle." King Alistair stood behind Vorlag, his expression thunderous. He had appeared so silently that no one had heard him approach. Vorlag turned, his sneer only faltering for a second. "Nephew, I was just acquainting myself with your staff, ensuring they are up to standard." "Her standards are my concern, not yours," Alistair said, his voice lethally soft. He stepped into the kitchen, his gaze sweeping over the room before landing on Seraphina. He saw the fear in her eyes, the way she tried to shrink into herself. The beast inside him snarled, a protective rage that took all his control to suppress. He wanted to rip his uncle's throat out for looking at her that way. He made a decision. It was reckless, dangerous, but the thought of leaving her vulnerable to Vorlag was intolerable. "You are no longer needed in the kitchens," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "You will attend to the royal library. Effective immediately." Seraphina stared at him, stunned. Alaric's jaw dropped. Lord Vorlag raised a skeptical eyebrow. The royal library had been sealed for years, a dusty tomb of forgotten knowledge. It was also located in the king's private wing, adjacent to his chambers. "The library?" Vorlag questioned, a slow, suspicious smile spreading across his face. "Taking a sudden interest in literature, are we, Alistair? Or do you simply wish to keep your little pet closer?" "I wish for my orders to be followed," Alistair bit out, his eyes flashing with a dangerous light. "Unless you wish to challenge them." Vorlag held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. "Of course not, Your Majesty." "By all means, let the Omega dust your books. I am sure she is eminently qualified." He gave Seraphina one last lingering look filled with malice and suspicion before sweeping out of the room. A tense silence remained. Alistair turned to Seraphina. "Go," he commanded, his tone brusque. "A guard will show you the way." She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and scurried out, not daring to look at him. She was confused, terrified, and bewildered. Why had he done that? He had not only defended her, but had brought her deeper into his own territory, placing her under his direct protection. It made no sense. The library was magnificent, though it was covered in a thick blanket of dust. Two-story shelves crammed with books lined the circular room, and a grand, unlit fireplace dominated one wall. A guard gave her a key and a stack of cleaning supplies before leaving her in absolute silence. For the first time since her arrival, she was not performing back-breaking labor. She ran a hand over a leather-bound spine, a sense of wonder momentarily eclipsing her fear. Her mother had taught her to read, a rare skill for an Omega. This place was a treasure trove. That night, she was in her new, slightly larger room near the library when the roars began. They were closer now, more visceral. She didn't hesitate. She crept not to the hallway, but to the library itself. The room shared a wall with the king's chambers, and in the center of that wall was the massive stone fireplace. The sound was coming through the stone, vibrating through the floor. She knelt on the cold hearth, pressed her palm against the chimney breast, and began to sing. Her song was stronger this time, imbued with her own roiling emotions: gratitude for his protection, fear of his uncle, confusion at his actions. She poured it all into the melody, sending it through the stone, a direct offering of peace. In his chambers, Alistair was on his knees, his body racked with convulsions. The shadows were writhing under his skin, more violent than ever before. Vorlag's presence in the castle agitated the beast, feeding it with rage. He was losing. He could feel the feral mind of the wolf beginning to overwhelm his own. And then, it came. The song. It was not a distant balm this time. It was a physical presence in the room, seeping through the very walls. It wrapped around the raging beast, not caging it, but cradling it. The violent shadows stilled, the pain receded, and the feral thoughts cleared. He slumped against the wall, breathing heavily, drenched in sweat. He knew. He knew she was on the other side of that wall. She was singing for him. The wolfless Omega, the discarded tribute, was the anchor for his soul. And he had just brought her within arm's reach of the monster she was taming. The thought filled him with a bone-deep terror that had nothing to do with his curse, and everything to do with what he might do to her if he ever truly lost control. The next few weeks passed in a strange, suspended reality. By day, Serafina cleaned and organized the library. She lost herself in stories of old kings, forgotten magic, and lands she would never see. The work was peaceful, a balm to her frayed nerves. She found a small cot in a storage alcove and began sleeping there, feeling safer within the book-lined walls than in her assigned room. By night, she kept her vigil. When the king's struggles began, she would go to the fireplace, press her hand to the cold stone, and sing. Their strange, silent ritual continued, an intimacy that was both profound and terrifying. She was healing the parts of him he kept hidden from the world, and in doing so, she was tying herself to him in a way she could not explain. Alistair found himself drawn to the library. He would enter under the pretext of finding a specific text, his movements stiff and formal. He would watch her as she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration, a smudge of dust on her cheek. He never mentioned the nights. He never acknowledged the song. But a silent conversation was taking place between them. He would leave a tray of food on a table for her, claiming it was leftovers from his own meal. He had a guard deliver a thick fur blanket to the library, with the gruff explanation that he would not have his books damaged by a winter chill. Each was a small, clumsy gesture of care, as foreign to him as a gentle touch. Serafina accepted them with a quiet confusion. The feared Shadow King, the man who had claimed her as a piece of property, was tending to her. The fear she felt in his presence was slowly being replaced by something far more complicated, a fluttering warmth that she was too afraid to name. One night the pain was different. The roars were not of rage, but of pure, unadulterated agony. They were weaker, interspersed with harsh, wet coughing. Serafina rushed to the hearth, her heart seizing with a new kind of fear. This wasn't the curse. This was something else. She sang until her throat was raw, but the sounds of his suffering continued. The pull, the need to soothe, was overwhelming. It dragged her from the safety of the library. Breaking every rule he had ever given her, she ran down the corridor to his chambers. The heavy oak doors were slightly ajar. Hesitantly, she pushed one open and slipped inside. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers in his own fireplace. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood. Alistair was slumped on the floor, his back against the far wall. A dark stain was spreading across the front of his tunic, and a dagger with a cruel, barbed tip lay on the floor a few feet away. An assassin's blade. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. He was conscious, but barely. His eyes were glazed with pain, his breathing shallow. He saw her, and a flicker of alarm crossed his face. "Get out," he rasped. But she couldn't. The sight of his wound, of his vulnerability, overrode all fear. She rushed to his side, kneeling in the pool of his blood. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Vorlag's work," he grunted, his eyes fluttering shut. "Poisoned. Poison." That explained the weakness, the different quality of his pain. Her song could soothe the magical beast within him, but she didn't know if it could fight a physical poison. But she had to try. "Don't," he warned, his voice a thread. "If I lose consciousness, the beast—" He didn't need to finish. If his human will failed, the curse would break free, and she would be trapped in the room with it. "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised them both. She tore a strip of cloth from her tunic and pressed it against the wound to staunch the bleeding. Then, she placed her other hand flat on his chest, over his heart. She closed her eyes and sang. Not the gentle, humming lullaby of their nights, but a song of raw power. She poured every ounce of her will, her energy, her very essence into the melody. She wasn't just soothing now, she was commanding. She sang to the blood, telling it to cleanse itself. She sang to the flesh, telling it to mend. A brilliant, silvery light erupted from her hand, engulfing them both. Alistair's body arched in a violent spasm. He cried out, a sound of both agony and release. Under her palm, she could feel his heart stutter, then beat with a stronger, steadier rhythm. The black veins of the poison that had begun to creep up his neck receded, burned away by her light. The effort was immense. It felt like she was pouring her own life force into him. The world began to spin, darkness encroaching on the edges of her vision. But she held on, singing until the last of the poison was gone, until his breathing was deep and even. When the light faded, she collapsed against him, utterly spent. Her head rested on his chest, and she could hear the strong, steady thump of his heart. He was alive. He was safe. Alistair slowly opened his eyes. The pain was gone. The fog of the poison had lifted. He looked down at the small woman curled against him, her pale hair fanned out over his blood-stained tunic. She had saved him. She had faced down his pain, his uncle's treachery, and the threat of his own inner monster, and she had not flinched. He carefully lifted a hand, his fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. The beast within him was silent, not sleeping, but watching through his eyes with a sense of profound reverence. "Mate?" A deep voice rumbled in the back of his mind. It was the first time the beast had spoken a coherent word in years. The realization crashed over him with the force of a tidal wave. It wasn't just a bond of healer and patient. It wasn't just a strange connection. It was fate. The one person in the world who could save him, the anchor for his cursed soul, was his mate. The wolfless Omega, his. A maelstrom of emotions warred within him, awe, gratitude, and a fierce, terrifying possessiveness. and beneath it all, a deep, chilling dread. To claim her would be to paint a target on her back. Vorlag had tried to kill him tonight. If he ever discovered what Seraphina was, what she meant to him, he would not hesitate to destroy her to get to him. He had to protect her, and the only way he could think to do that was to push her away. Seraphina awoke with a start, finding herself not on the cold floor of the king's chambers, but tucked into the cot in the library's alcove, the thick fur blanket pulled up to her chin. For a moment she thought she had dreamed the entire terrifying episode, but then she saw it, a dark brownish stain on the sleeve of her tunic. His blood. She sat up, her body aching with a deep, soul-level exhaustion. The memory of pouring her energy into him, of the blinding silver light, was vivid and real. She had saved his life, and he had carried her here. She spent the day in a haze of anxiety, waiting for a summons, for a punishment, for anything. But nothing came. The castle was quiet. She saw no sign of the king. It was as if the night had never happened. The silence was more unnerving than any anger would have been. Late in the afternoon, the library doors opened. It was not the king, but his beta, a stern, powerfully built wolf named Gideon. She had seen him at the king's side, his expression always grim and watchful. He regarded her with an unreadable expression. "The king requests you pack your things," Gideon said, his voice a low baritone. "You are to be moved to the North Tower." Seraphina's blood ran cold. The North Tower was the most remote, isolated part of the citadel. It was where honored guests, or high-value prisoners, were kept. "Why?" she whispered. "The king's orders," was the only explanation he offered. "It is for your protection." Protection or imprisonment? She had no choice but to obey. She gathered her few belongings, a spare tunic, a small book she had been reading, and followed Gideon through a labyrinth of corridors she had never seen before. The North Tower was cleaner, less desolate than the rest of the castle, the rooms furnished with a stark elegance. Her new room was twice the size of her alcove, with a real bed and a window that overlooked the vast empty expanse of the northern mountains. It was beautiful, and it was a cage. "You are not to leave this tower," Gideon instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Your meals will be brought to you. The king will see you when he is able." He turned to leave, but hesitated at the door. "What you did last night, he would not have survived without you." He gave her a look of grudging respect, then left, the sound of the heavy bolt sliding into place echoing in the sudden silence. Alistair stood in his chambers, staring at his reflection in a silver mirror. His wound was gone, not even a scar remaining. He felt stronger than he had in years, the poison purged, the beast within him strangely quiescent, watchful. But his soul was in turmoil. He had his mate. The fates had given him the one person who could heal his curse, the one person who could anchor him. And he had locked her in a tower. It felt like a betrayal. But Vorlag was still in the castle, his failed assassination attempt cloaked as an unfortunate sparring accident. His uncle was watching, waiting for another opportunity, another sign of weakness. And Alistair now had the greatest weakness of all, someone he could not bear to lose. He had to show the world, and especially Vorlag, that the Omega meant nothing to him. He had to treat her like a tool, a useful asset to be guarded, not a cherished mate to be courted. The cruelty of it clawed at him. That night, the familiar agony of his curse began to build. He paced his room, the shadows writhing at the edge of his vision. He needed her song. He needed her presence. But he could not go to her. He had to endure this alone, to prove he was still the same cold, untouchable king. The pain mounted, a crescendo of claws and teeth in his soul. He threw his head back and roared, a sound of pure, defiant misery. In the North Tower, Seraphina heard him. The sound was fainter now, muffled by distance, but it was unmistakable. Her heart ached with his pain. She went to the cold stone wall, pressed her hand against it, and sang. She didn't know if he could hear her, if her gift could travel so far. But she sang anyway, pouring her worry and her confusion and the strange, budding tenderness she felt for him into the melody. Alistair froze mid-stride. Faintly, like a memory on the wind, he heard it. Her song. It was a mere whisper, robbed of its potency by the stone and distance. But it was there. It was not enough to tame the beast, but it was enough to give him the strength to fight it himself. It was a reminder that he was not alone. He sank to his knees, gripping his head as he fought the transformation, his knuckles white. He would not lose control. He would not become the monster. Not while she was in his castle. Not while she was singing for him. This was their new, agonizing reality. A king pushing away his salvation to protect her, and a healer singing her heart out to a man who had imprisoned her. It was an act of defiance, a desperate sacrifice, and an emotional climax that offered no comfort, only the promise of more pain to come. Feelings had been revealed not by words, but by blood and light and song. Yet the threats circling them prevented any hope of resolution. They were closer than ever, and more painfully far apart. Days bled into weeks. Seraphina's gilded cage remained locked. Gideon brought her meals, his expression always a mask of stoic duty. He brought her books from the library, a silent acknowledgement of her only solace. She read voraciously, devouring tales of heroism and love, worlds away from her own stark reality. She did not see the king, she only felt him. Each night, his distant pain would call to her, and she would answer, her song a lonely vigil in the dark. She grew thinner, paler, the nightly expenditure of her energy taking its toll. It was a slow drain on her life force, giving her strength to him across the castle. Alistair was fighting his own battle. He immersed himself in the duties of his kingship, his manner colder and more ruthless than ever. He drove his council, his guards, and himself to the breaking point. He was trying to build a wall of ice and steel around his heart, a fortress to protect the one vulnerable part of him, his feelings for Seraphina. Vorlag watched him, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. The king was different. The assassination attempt should have weakened him, but he seemed stronger, more focused. Vorlag couldn't understand it, and he couldn't find the Omega. She had vanished from the castle's common areas, and his spies could learn nothing. The mystery gnawed at him. He knew, with a predator's instinct, that the girl was somehow the key. One evening, Gideon arrived with Seraphina's dinner tray. He lingered at the door, his usual haste gone. "There is to be a grand council," he said, his voice low. "All the alphas of the northern clans will be in attendance." Seraphina looked up from her book. "Why are you telling me this?" "Lord Vorlag has invoked the old laws. He is making a formal challenge for the throne." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Gideon's jaw tightened. "On the grounds that the king has not produced an heir, that he has not taken a mate, and," he hesitated, "that his wolf is unsound. He is demanding a trial by combat, a duel to the death. Both alphas must shift." Seraphina felt the blood drain from her face. A trap. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. If Alistair refused, he would be seen as a coward, his claim forfeited. If he accepted, he would be forced to reveal his cursed, monstrous form to all the assembled alphas. They would declare him an abomination and hand the throne to Vorlag. Either way, Vorlag won. "He cannot accept," she breathed, standing up, her hands clutching the book so tightly her knuckles were white. "He has no choice," Gideon said, his voice grim. "To refuse is to admit the charge is true." The duel is in 3 days. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea. He didn't know the nature of her gift, not fully, but he knew she was the reason his king was still alive. He was hoping for another miracle. For the next 3 days, Seraphina felt nothing from the king. No nightly roars of pain, no psychic agony. There was only a profound, terrifying silence. It was the silence of a man who had accepted his fate. He was preparing to die. He was deliberately cutting himself off from her, refusing her aid, believing his death was the only way to keep both her and his secret safe. The day of the duel dawned gray and cold. From her tower window, Seraphina could see the courtyard below, where a great dueling ring had been prepared. Alphas and their entourages were gathering, their banners snapping in the wind. The air crackled with tension. She was a prisoner, helpless. She paced her room like a caged animal, her heart a frantic, wild thing in her chest. She could not let him die. She would not. The thought of a world without him in it, even a world where he had locked her away, was a bleak, empty void. The duel began. She couldn't see the combatants clearly, only the surge of the crowd. She heard Vorlag's booming voice issue the formal challenge, and then she heard Alistair's reply, calm and steady, accepting the terms. He was going to fight in his human form. He was going to let Vorlag's wolf tear him apart rather than reveal his own. A desperate plan, born of love and madness, formed in her mind. She ran to the door, pounding on the heavy wood. "Gideon! Let me out! Gideon!" There was no answer. He was in the courtyard, at his king's side. Panic seized her. She looked around the room, her eyes darting from the barred window to the stone walls. There was no escape. She was trapped. She slid to the floor, a sob of pure despair catching in her throat. Then her eyes fell on the fireplace. It was small, decorative, and had likely not been used in a century. But where there was a chimney, there was a way out. It was a mad hope. She was small, but it would be a tight, filthy squeeze. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled into the hearth, her tunic tearing on the rough stone. Soot rained down on her, filling her hair, her eyes, her lungs. She found purchase on the jagged bricks and began to climb, her fingers and knees scraping raw against the flue. It was dark, claustrophobic, and she fought back a wave of terror. She focused on one thought: Alistair. Above, she saw a sliver of gray sky. Hope surged through her. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, and finally hauled her body onto the rooftop, gasping in the cold, clean air. She was filthy, bleeding, and trembling, but she was free. She scrambled across the steep slate shingles, her bare feet finding precarious holds. She made her way to the edge of the roof overlooking the main courtyard. Below her, the scene was exactly as she had feared. Lord Vorlag stood in the center of the ring, already shifted. He was an enormous, ugly brute of a wolf, with mottled gray fur and cruel yellow eyes. Opposite him stood Alistair, in human form, a sword in his hand. He looked regal and defiant, but he was no match for a shifted alpha. Vorlag was toying with him, circling, snapping, driving him back. Alistair was already bleeding from a dozen shallow cuts. The end was near. "Shift, nephew!" Vorlag's voice, distorted by his wolf form, echoed in the arena. "Show them the great wolf of the Shadow King. Or die a man." Alistair raised his sword, his face set like stone, preparing for the final charge. "No!" The cry was ripped from Seraphina's throat, a raw, desperate scream that cut through the tension in the courtyard. Every head turned, looking for the source of the sound. They looked everywhere but up. She didn't think. She acted. She found a thick rope of ivy clinging to the castle wall and began her descent. It was reckless, suicidal. The ivy tore at her hands. The drop was terrifying. But she didn't stop. She landed in a heap in the shadows behind the main dais, a crumpled mess of soot and desperation. She pushed herself to her feet and ran. She burst through the line of guards, ignoring their shouts of surprise, and sprinted into the dueling ring. She threw herself in front of Alistair, a small, ragged shield between him and Vorlag's snarling wolf. "Stop!" she cried, her voice shaking but clear. The entire world seemed to stop. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The wolfless Omega, the king's rumored pet, stood in rags, covered in soot, defying a shifted alpha. It was madness. Alistair stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. "Seraphina, get back," he ordered, his voice strained. "No," she said, her gaze locked on the furious yellow eyes of Vorlag's wolf. "I will not let you kill him." Vorlag let out a rumbling growl of amusement and contempt. "And how will you stop me, little mouse? With your tears?" "With this," she whispered. She ignored Vorlag. She ignored the shocked stares of the alphas. She turned to Alistair, the man she loved, the man who was willing to die for her. She placed her filthy, trembling hands on his chest, over his heart. She closed her eyes and let her power, all of it, surge free. It was not a quiet lullaby this time. It was an anthem, a great soaring crescendo of light and love and fierce, defiant hope. Her song echoed through the arena, a physical force that made the very stones vibrate. A column of brilliant silver light erupted from her, engulfing them both, blinding the onlookers. Alistair felt her power pour into him, not just soothing the beast, but bonding with it, merging with it. He felt her courage, her love, her absolute faith in him. It was an anchor, but it was also a key, unlocking a control he never knew he possessed. He had to make a choice: hide his monster and die, or embrace it to protect her. There was no choice. He would always choose her. He threw his head back and roared, and this time it was not a sound of pain, but of power. He began to shift. The crowd recoiled in fear, expecting an abomination. Black, shadowy energy exploded from him, but it was different now. It was intertwined with the silver light of Seraphina's song. His form grew, immense and terrifying, a wolf made of living shadow and cold starlight. His eyes were not red with rage, but glowed with a calm, silver intelligence. He was not a monster. He was magnificent, a king of shadows, anchored by a queen of light. He turned his massive head and looked down at Seraphina, who still stood with her hands on his chest, her song unwavering. He lowered his head and gently nudged her hand with his nose, a gesture of profound gratitude and love. Then, he turned to face his uncle. Vorlag's wolf was frozen, its bravado gone, replaced by primal terror. It had expected a monster to condemn, not a god to fear. Alistair let out a low growl that shook the very foundations of the citadel. The fight was already over. The shadow wolf that was Alistair took a single, deliberate step forward. The ground seemed to tremble. Lord Vorlag, still in his brutish wolf form, instinctively took a step back, a whine of fear escaping his throat. The hunter had become the prey. Alistair did not attack with mindless fury. His movements were controlled, precise, and utterly dominant. He flowed across the dueling ring like a river of night, his shadowy form seeming to absorb the very light around him. He didn't need to bite or claw. He slammed into Vorlag with the force of a battering ram, sending the larger wolf flying across the ring to crash into the stone barrier. Vorlag scrambled to his feet, snarling, but it was pure posturing. Fear rolled off him in waves. Alistair stalked him, hurting him, his immense size and the sheer weight of his power pressing down on his uncle. He was demonstrating not just superior strength, but superior control. He was showing every alpha present that this was not a curse, but a power unlike any they had ever witnessed. He cornered Vorlag against the wall. Instead of ripping out his throat, Alistair simply placed one massive, shadowy paw on his uncle's chest, pinning him to the ground. The pressure was immense, and Vorlag's wolf whimpered, its ribs groaning. The message was clear: I can crush you at any moment. Alistair held him there for a long, silent moment, his silver eyes boring into Vorlag's terrified yellow ones. Then, he let out a final, deafening roar that was not a challenge, but a proclamation of victory. He lifted his paw and stepped back. He had won. He had proven his strength and his right to rule without killing his challenger, an act of mercy that was more powerful than any execution. Slowly, gracefully, the shadows receded, coalescing back into the form of a man. Alistair stood tall and whole, his human skin unmarked, his breathing steady. He was no longer just a king, he was a legend. He turned his back on his defeated, trembling uncle and walked toward the center of the ring, where Seraphina stood waiting, her song having softened to a gentle hum. The crowd was utterly silent, stunned into submission. They had witnessed the impossible. They had seen the Shadow King's beast, and it was not a monster, but a marvel, perfectly controlled and anchored by the love of a wolfless Omega in rags. Alistair stopped in front of her. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them in the center of the ring. He looked at her, at the soot on her face, the tear in her tunic, the raw scrapes on her hands. He saw not a weak Omega, but the fiercest, most courageous soul he had ever known. "You saved me," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You saved me first," she whispered back, her hands still resting on his chest. In front of all the assembled clans, in front of his defeated enemy, Alistair lowered his head. He captured her lips in a kiss that was both a desperate claiming and a tender surrender. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a public declaration more binding than any treaty. When he finally pulled back, he looked into her eyes and saw his own future reflected there. "They called you wolfless," he said, his voice ringing with pride. "But your soul is the strongest I have ever known." It called to mine. It anchored me. He turned to face the stunned alphas. "You have witnessed my strength," he declared, his voice booming with absolute authority. "Now you will witness my choice." He looked back at Seraphina, his expression softening. "There will be no more hiding. No more towers. Your place is by my side." He gently took her hand, his thumb stroking over her scraped knuckles. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture of fealty from a king to his queen. He lowered his head to the juncture of her neck and shoulder. She knew what was coming. She felt no fear, only a profound sense of rightness, of coming home. She tilted her head, granting him access. His teeth, sharp and definitive, sank into her skin. A jolt of pure energy, of silver light and deep shadow shot through her. It was not painful. It was a completion. The mating bond snapped fully into place, a tangible thing of power and light, of shared souls and intertwined fates. She felt his strength, his history, his deep, abiding love pour into her. And he felt her healing calm, her resilience, her unwavering devotion become a permanent part of him. The mark on her neck glowed for a moment with a soft silver light before settling into an intricate, swirling pattern that looked like a shadow cradling a star. Alistair raised his head, his eyes glowing with the same silver light. He faced his people, his arm wrapped securely around his mate's waist, holding her close. "Behold your Luna!" he roared. For a moment there was silence. Then, one alpha, then another, then all of them, bowed their heads in deference. They were not just bowing to their king, but to the small woman in rags who had tamed his shadows and, in doing so, had secured the future of all the northern clans. The societal order had been upended. Compassion had proven to be as powerful as ferocity, and love had conquered a curse. Their new beginning had been forged in a trial of blood and shadows, and solidified with a song. 1 year later, the great hall of the citadel was filled with warmth and light. Rich tapestries depicting a silver star and a noble shadow wolf now hung on the walls, replacing the grim, warlike banners of the past. The fire in the grand hearth burned brightly, casting a cheerful glow over the assembled alphas and their families, gathered not for a council of war, but for a midwinter festival. Laughter, a sound once foreign to these halls, echoed off the stone. At the head of the great table sat King Alistair and Luna Seraphina. Alistair was no longer the cold, isolated Shadow King. While his authority was absolute, it was now tempered with a quiet confidence and a deep well of peace that radiated from him. He smiled often, a sight that had once been rarer than a summer snow. Seraphina sat beside him, no longer a ghost in rags, but a radiant queen in a simple but elegant gown of deep blue velvet. The mating mark on her neck was a proud declaration of her status. Her belly was swollen, round with the promise of their first child, a miracle that had silenced the last of the dissenters who had questioned the union of a powerful alpha and a wolfless omega. Her gift had flourished. She had established houses of healing throughout the clans, teaching others that strength came in many forms. The old, brutal ways were slowly giving way to a new era of compassion, guided by their Luna's gentle hand. Omegas were no longer disposable. They were respected for their unique contributions to the pack. Alistair reached over, placing a hand possessively on her stomach, a look of pure adoration on his face. The baby kicked, and he chuckled, a low, happy rumble. "Our son is impatient, like his father." "He is strong," Seraphina corrected softly, placing her hand over his, "like both his parents." Later that evening, they stood on a balcony overlooking the snow-dusted mountains. The sky was clear, studded with a million diamond-bright stars. The wind was cold, but she felt nothing but warmth, wrapped in Alistair's arms, a heavy fur cloak draped over them both. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked, her voice a playful murmur. He nuzzled her hair, his shadowy wolf stirring contentedly beneath his skin. "I thought I craved silence," he admitted, his voice low and intimate. "But I was wrong. I was just waiting for the right song." He often shifted now, not in pain, but in peace. His magnificent shadow wolf form was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a sight of wonder. The pups of the citadel loved to climb on his back when he lay by the fire, their squeals of delight a testament to the change he and Seraphina had brought. The beast was not a curse to be tamed, but a part of him to be understood, a part of him that was wholly and completely devoted to his mate. He turned her in his arms, his silver-flecked eyes gazing down at her with a love so profound it still sometimes stole her breath. "They laughed at you, that day in the meadow," he said softly, his thumb caressing her cheek. "They threw away their greatest treasure." "And their king found it?" she finished, a happy tear tracing a path down her cheek. He wiped it away gently. "I am the one who was found, my love. You sang my soul back from the darkness." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss under the winter stars, a king and his queen, a shadow and his light, their two halves made whole. The kingdom was safe, the people were prospering, and their family was just beginning. The rejected Omega had not just found a home, she had built one, founded on the radical belief that the greatest strength of all was the courage to love, to heal, and to sing in the dark.